Frank Sinatra was at the height of his performance at the Sands Hotel when something unexpected happened. An elderly waiter stumbled right in the middle of the room, spilling expensive drinks all over the most important clients in Las Vegas. The crowd booed, security advanced, but what Frank did next left 1,200 people completely speechless. It was March 23rd, 1963, and that night would forever change how Las Vegas treated its invisible workers. The Sands Hotel and Casino was the epicenter of Las Vegas glamour in the 1960s. There, Frank Sinatra wasn't just a singer. He was practically royalty. Owner of 9% of the casino, leader of the famous Rat Pack, and the man who could fill any room just with the announcement of his presence. That March night, the Copa room was packed beyond capacity. 1,200 people crammed into a space designed for 800. Celebrities, tycoons, politicians, all of Las Vegas that mattered was there. Frank had just finished an explosive version of I've Got You Under My Skin when the band began the opening chords of Fly Me to the Moon. The audience was hypnotized. Women in long dresses and men in tuxedos sipped martinis, while expensive cigar smoke floated through the atmosphere like mist in a blue dream. But backstage, in places the public never saw, there was another world functioning. A world of waiters running with heavy trays, cooks sweating over industrial stoves, and janitors who would start working when the last person left at 4 in the morning. One of these worlds was about to collide with the other in a way no one could predict. Thomas William McCarthy was 67 years old and had worked as a waiter at the Sands for 23 years. More than half his adult life was dedicated to serving drinks to rich people, while his own feet screamed in pain inside shoes that had been repaired 3 times. Thomas, or Tommy as everyone called him, was the kind of man who became invisible out of sheer necessity. Short, thin, with gray hair always combed back with cheap brilliantine, he had the ability to appear exactly when you needed another drink and disappear before you thought to thank him. But that night, Tommy wasn't well. He wasn't well at all, actually. His wife, Margaret, had been hospitalized at Sunrise Hospital for 3 days with severe pneumonia. The doctor said she needed expensive antibiotics, intensive treatment, things that the minimal insurance the Sands offered employees simply didn't cover. Tommy had asked for an advance from the manager that afternoon. The answer was direct and cruel. McCarthy, you already owe 2 months of advances. Either you work tonight, or you can look for a job elsewhere. So there he was, carrying a tray with 8 expensive martinis, walking through the packed room while Frank Sinatra sang about flying to the moon, and all Tommy could think about was that his wife was in a cold hospital room, alone, possibly dying, while he served drinks to people who spent in one night what he earned in 3 months. The stage lights changed to a deep blue. Frank held the microphone with that relaxed posture only he had, as if he were chatting with old friends in a living room. In other words, hold my hand. His voice filled every corner of the Copa room, soft as velvet, strong as steel. Tommy was 3 meters from table 14, where a Hollywood producer, a New York senator, and their respective wives covered in jewels sat. That's when it happened. His right foot, which had been hurting for weeks, simply gave out. It wasn't a normal stumble. It was as if all 67 years of his body finally said no more. His leg buckled, his knee hit the floor, and the tray with 8 martinis flew through the air in slow motion. The noise was deafening. Glass breaking, liquid splashing, women screaming when cold gin hit their silk dresses. The music didn't stop immediately. The band, professional as they were, continued playing for a few more bars, while Frank turned to see what had happened. On the floor, among glass shards and puddles of drink, Tommy tried to get up. His hands trembled, not just from the fall, but from the absolute shame of having ruined the moment. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw security approaching. He saw the manager, Mr. Harrison, advancing with his face red with rage. And he saw something else. He saw all those rich people, all those important people, looking at him as if he were an insect that had crawled into a place where it didn't belong. Incompetent someone shouted. Throw that old man out, another yelled. The senator's wife stood up, looking horrified at her ruined dress, while her husband complained loudly about the quality of staff these days. Frank Sinatra had stopped singing. The microphone was away from his mouth, hanging beside his body. His blue eyes, those eyes that had enchanted millions, were fixed on the scene unfolding before him. The band had stopped completely now. The silence was so dense you could hear the glass shards being crushed under the shoes of the security guards approaching Tommy. What no one knew, not even the Rat Pack members sitting at their reserved tables, was that Frank Sinatra had a history with invisibility. A history that began long before fame, long before the spotlights, at a time when he himself was invisible. Hoboken, New Jersey, 1930. Francis Albert Sinatra was 15 years old and worked delivering newspapers on freezing mornings before school. His father, Anthony, was a firefighter, but the salary barely covered rent for the small apartment where they lived. His mother, Dolly, did what she could, but the Great Depression had turned everyone into desperate survivors. Frank remembered mornings when his breakfast was just stale bread soaked in water with sugar. He remembered wearing the same patched pants day after day, being called stick legs and skeleton boy by the richer boys at school. But the memory that never left him, the one that came back to him at strange moments, was of a specific day in December 1931. He was delivering newspapers in the wealthy area of Hoboken, those big houses with perfect lawns and nice cars in the garage. At one of them, a Christmas party was happening. Through the lit windows, Frank could see families laughing, a huge decorated tree, tables full of food. He had stopped for a moment, just a moment, to look, and then the front door opened. A man in an expensive suit came out, saw Frank standing there with his torn newspaper bag and patched clothes, and said something that was branded in fire on young Francis's soul. "What are you looking at, boy? Get out of here before I call the police. People like you don't belong in this neighborhood. People like you." Frank never forgot. Even when fame came, even when he became one of the biggest stars in the world, that moment of being treated as if he were less than human, as if he were invisible, never completely left him. And now, on the stage of the Sands Hotel, looking at that elderly waiter on the floor, surrounded by people who looked at him with disdain, something in that old memory awakened. Frank saw in Tommy McCarthy something he recognized. Not weakness, but the desperate dignity of someone trying to survive in a world that insists on not seeing him. Security had reached Tommy now. Big hands grabbed his thin arms, starting to lift him roughly. "Let's go, old man. You're fired," one of them said loud enough for the entire room to hear. People were starting to laugh now, conversations returning, the moment of embarrassment transforming into an anecdote to tell later. "Wait." Frank's voice cut through the air like a blade. It wasn't shouted. "Frank." Sinatra never needed to shout. That single word, spoken into the microphone with that quiet authority only he possessed, made the entire Copa room freeze again. The security guard stopped mid-motion. The manager, Mr. Harrison, who was marching toward Tommy with visible fury on his face, stopped as if he'd hit an invisible wall. Frank placed the microphone back on the stand delicately, as if he had all the time in the world. Then he did something no one expected. He stepped down from the stage. This simply didn't happen. Frank Sinatra didn't step down from the stage in the middle of a song. He didn't interrupt shows. But there he was, walking with those confident steps, his impeccable tuxedo catching the light in a way that made him look like he was in a black and white movie even in real life. The room was so quiet, you could hear the fabric of his pants rustling as he walked. Each step resonated. Dean Martin, sitting at his reserved table, had stopped with his whiskey glass halfway to his mouth. Sammy Davis Jr. leaned forward, eyes wide. No one, absolutely no one, knew what was happening. Frank arrived at where Tommy was, still held by security. Up close, the difference between the two men was striking. Frank tall, handsome, wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than Tommy earned in a year. Tommy small, aged, with his waiter uniform stained with gin and humiliation written in every line of his wrinkled face. "Let him go," Frank said calmly to the security guards. It wasn't a request. It was an order. The hands loosened immediately. Frank extended his own hand to Tommy, helping him stand completely up. "What's your name, partner?" Tommy was trembling. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He was looking at Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was holding his hand, and the entire universe had stopped making sense. "Aye, Tommy. Thomas McCarthy, Mr. Sinatra." Tommy Frank repeated, as if tasting the name. Then he did something even more surprising. He took out his own pocket handkerchief, that perfectly folded white silk handkerchief, and began cleaning the gin from Tommy's hands. "Are you hurt, Tommy? Does that need ice?" The manager, Mr. Harrison, had recovered some courage. "Mr. Sinatra, please, let's handle this. We'll remove this employee immediately and bring your drinks." "Remove?" Frank turned, and the look he gave Harrison was capable of freezing lava. "Remove to where exactly?" "Well, he clearly isn't fit to work tonight, Mr. Sinatra. He ruined." He stumbled. Frank interrupted, his voice still calm, but with a thread of steel running underneath. "He's a human being who stumbled. Since when is that a capital crime?" Harrison opened and closed his mouth like a fish. At table 14, the senator and his wife were exchanging uncomfortable glances. The Hollywood producer suddenly found his glass very interesting. Frank turned back to Tommy. "Tommy, how many years have you worked here?" 23 years, sir." Tommy's voice was just a whisper. 23 years, Frank repeated, turning to the audience. Now he was speaking to the entire room, and each word carried weight. "This man has served you for 23 years. Served drinks, cleaned tables, worked when he was sick, worked on holidays. And in one night, his body gives out for a moment, and your reaction is what? Booze? Mockery?" The silence now was different. It wasn't curiosity or shock. It was shame. You could feel it spreading through the room like ink in water. But Frank wasn't finished. He looked directly at Tommy, and his next question was asked with a gentleness that made the old waiter's eyes fill with tears. "Tommy, tell me something. Why are you working tonight? Something's wrong. I can see it in your eyes." And then it happened. Maybe it was the kindness after cruelty. Maybe it was the exhaustion of 3 days of terror and worry. Maybe it was just that he had nothing left to lose. Tommy McCarthy, who had been invisible for 23 years, who had learned not to exist, who had survived by being nobody, broke. "My wife," he said, and his voice cracked like thin ice. "Margaret, she's in the hospital. Pneumonia. They say she needs treatment, but I don't have money. I asked for an advance, but they said." He couldn't finish. Tears were flowing freely now down his wrinkled face. Frank stood completely still. His eyes, those famous blue eyes, were fixed on Tommy as if there was no one else in the room. And then, slowly and deliberately, Frank Sinatra did something that would become legendary in Las Vegas. He took out his wallet from the inside pocket of his tuxedo. It was expensive brown leather, the kind of wallet that cost more than Tommy's monthly salary. Frank opened it and began taking out money. Not a few bills. All of them. Stacks of $100 bills, green and crisp. "How much?" Frank asked simply. Tommy was shaking his head, hands raised as if he could stop what was happening. No, Mr. Sinatra, I can't." "How much, Tommy?" Frank repeated, firmer now. "How much did the doctor say it would cost?" $2,000, Tommy whispered, as if the amount was too big to say out loud. "But I'll figure out a way, Frank counted $300 bills. $3,000. He took Tommy's hand, which was still trembling, and placed the money in it, closing the old man's fingers over the bills. 3,000, Frank said. 2 for the hospital. 1 for you and Margaret to have some time together when she gets out. No work. Just time." Tommy was sobbing now. Deep broken sounds that came from somewhere deeper than his lungs. He tried to speak, tried to think, but words wouldn't come. Frank pulled him into a hug. There, in the middle of the most glamorous room in Las Vegas, the biggest star in the world hugged an elderly waiter who smelled of cheap gin and honest sweat, and held him while he cried. When they finally separated, Frank kept his hands on Tommy's shoulders. "You're going to the hospital now. Not tomorrow, not after your shift. Now, I'm going to have my driver take you." Then Frank turned to Harrison, and his voice lost all gentleness. "And you. If this man doesn't have a job when he comes back, if there's any retaliation, anything, you'll answer to me personally. Understood?" Harrison swallowed hard and nodded quickly, but Frank still wasn't finished. He picked up the microphone again, walking to the stage while holding it. His voice filled the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to tell you something. Many years ago, I was invisible too. I know what it's like to be treated as if you don't matter. And I made a promise to myself that if I ever got to a place where I could make a difference, I would." He pointed to where Tommy was being gently guided by one of the staff members toward the side exit. "That man there has worked harder in one day than most of us work in a month. He served, cared for, cleaned. And when his body finally said no more, when he stumbled, you laughed." The shame in the room was palpable now. Several women had tears running down, ruining their expensive makeup. Men looked at their drinks as if the answers might be at the bottom of the glasses. Tonight, Frank continued, "Each one of you is going to leave a tip. But it won't be a normal tip. It'll be what you think a human being's dignity is worth. All the money will go to a fund I'm creating right now. The Thomas McCarthy Fund. For SANS employees facing medical emergencies." He paused, letting that sink in. "And just to be clear, I'll be checking. Because if you can pay $50 for a martini, you can pay $100 to make sure the person who served that martini can see a doctor when they need to." The room exploded in applause. It wasn't the polite applause that had accompanied his songs. It was something different, deeper, more real. Frank waved to the band. "Now, let's get back to what we came to do. But this time, let's sing with a little more gratitude." He began "Fly Me to the Moon" again, but something had changed. The music had more weight now, more meaning. When he got to the line, in other words, "Hold my hand," every person in that room knew it wasn't about romance. It was about humanity. Backstage, Tommy was in Frank's car, holding the money like it was a child. He couldn't stop crying, but now they were different tears. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope. At Sunrise Hospital, Margaret McCarthy was lying in her bed, looking at the ceiling, worried about her husband. She didn't know that in 20 minutes, he would come running in, with enough money to save her life, and a story she could barely believe. Back at the Cooper room, something extraordinary was happening. As the night progressed, the waiters and waitresses noticed something different. People were looking them in the eyes, saying thank you. Really saying thank you. Not just that kind of automatic thanks you say without thinking. And when the bill came to the tables, something unprecedented happened. Table 14, where the senator and his wife with the ruined dress sat, left a $500 tip. The Hollywood producer left $300. Table after table, the tips were insane. They weren't 20%. They were 200%, 300%, sometimes more. By the end of the night, the improvised fund had collected over $45,000. $45,000 for Las Vegas workers who were never seen until they stumbled. But the story doesn't end there. Because what Frank Sinatra did that night created waves that spread far beyond the Sands Hotel. 3 days later, Tommy returned to work. But when he arrived, he discovered things had changed. Mr. Harrison, that manager who had threatened to fire him, had been transferred to an administrative position away from employee contact. In his place was someone new, someone who had been promoted from within the ranks of the waiters. And there was more. The Sands had announced a new health plan for all employees. A real plan, not that minimal coverage they had before. A plan that covered emergencies, serious illnesses, even preventive treatments. Other hotels and casinos in Las Vegas watched. Some laughed, calling Frank an idealist. But others, especially after seeing the positive publicity the Sands received, began to follow suit. Within 6 months, most of the big Las Vegas establishments had improved their employee benefits. Margaret McCarthy recovered completely. The antibiotics worked, the pneumonia receded, and 6 weeks later she was home, weaker but alive. Tommy never stopped telling the story of that night, to his children, his grandchildren, to anyone who wanted to listen. It wasn't about the money, he always said. It was about being seen, about matching. Frank and Tommy developed an unlikely friendship. It wasn't a big public friendship. There were no photos of them in magazines. A few times a month, when Frank was in Vegas, he would specifically request that Tommy work his table. And when Tommy arrived, Frank would stand up, shake his hand, and ask about Margaret. More than once, other waiters saw Frank slip extra envelopes to Tommy. For the grandkids, he would say with a wink. Tommy tried to refuse, but Frank was insistent in a way that didn't admit arguments. In December 1963, 9 months after that fateful night, the Sands Hotel organized its annual Christmas party for employees. It was an event that normally happened in the basement, with some cheap decorations and food left over from the main banquet. But that year was different. Frank had insisted it be held in the Copa Room itself, the same room where the biggest stars in the world performed. And he didn't just insist, he showed up. Frank Sinatra, who could be anywhere in the world, who had invitations to parties in Hollywood and New York, chose to spend the employee Christmas night at the Sands. He sang for them. Not a complete show, but a few songs. And when it was time for Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas, he asked Tommy to come up on stage with him. Tommy, now 68 years old, but looking 10 years younger than that terrible night in March, timidly climbed onto the stage. Frank put his arm around the shoulders of the shorter man and sang directly to him. Through the years, we all will be together, if the fates allow. There wasn't a dry eye among the 200 employees present, because they all knew the story. They all knew what Frank had done, and they all knew that, somehow, the world had changed a little that night. The story of what happened at the Sands on March 23rd, 1963 spread. Not immediately, and not the way stories spread today with internet and social media, but it spread the way important things spread, from person to person, from heart to heart. Other artists began paying more attention to how workers at their shows were treated. Dean Martin began insisting on better conditions for staff. Sammy Davis Jr. created his own fund for black employees who faced discrimination and financial difficulties. But more important than that, something changed in the culture of Las Vegas. Slowly, gradually, invisible workers began to be seen. Not completely, not perfectly, but more than before. And it all started because one man stumbled and another man chose to see humanity instead of inconvenience. Years later, in 1971, a young journalist from the Las Vegas Sun got a rare interview with Frank Sinatra. At the end, when the official recording had finished, he asked about Tommy McCarthy. Frank had been quiet for a long moment, looking somewhere distant. You know, he finally said, "Everyone thinks that night was about me helping Tommy. But the truth is Tommy saved me." The journalist was confused. "Saved you? How?" "I was lost," Frank said simply. "Had all the money in the world, all the fame, all the things I thought I wanted when I was a kid in Hoboken. But I was lost. Didn't know why I was doing any of it anymore. And then I saw Tommy on the floor, saw how people looked at him, and I remembered who I was before all this. Remembered I had made a promise." "What promise?" "That if I got somewhere, I'd use it to make a difference. Tommy reminded me of that. He gave me back my purpose." The interview was never published the way the journalist wanted. Frank asked that that part be kept off the record, but the journalist wrote it anyway, in his personal diary, where it stayed for decades. Tommy McCarthy worked at the Sands until he retired in 1975, at 79 years old. He and Margaret had 18 more years together before she passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1981. Tommy followed her 3 years later, in 1984. At Tommy's funeral, there were flowers from everywhere, from old co-workers, from clients he had served, from people who had heard his story. And in the center, a huge arrangement with a simple card. "To my friend Tommy, who taught me to see Frank." Frank Sinatra couldn't attend the funeral. He was recording in New York, but he called each of Tommy's 3 children personally to give his condolences. And discreetly, very discreetly, he paid all funeral expenses and created a scholarship fund in Tommy's name for the grandchildren to go to college. The story that Tommy and Frank shared became legend in Las Vegas. It's told to new employees as a reminder that they matter. It's told to managers as a reminder of how to treat people. And it's told to visitors as a reminder that behind every service is a person with a story. The Thomas McCarthy Fund, created that night impromptu, still exists today. It was institutionalized, expanded, and now offers assistance to hospitality workers throughout Nevada. To this day, more than 60 years later, It has helped over 15,000 people deal with medical emergencies. In the place where the Sands Hotel used to stand, there's now another resort. The Sands was imploded in 1996, transformed into dust and memories. But if you ask older Las Vegas workers, they'll tell you something remains. A spirit, a memory, a lesson. There's a small plaque at what is now the Venetian Resort, built on the site of the old Sands. It's hidden backstage, where only employees see. It says, in memory of Thomas McCarthy and all the invisible workers of Las Vegas. You matter. You are seen. Frank Sinatra, March 1963. Every new employee is taken to see that plaque during their orientation. It's a tradition that started when the Venetian opened and continues to this day. Because the story needs to be told. The lesson needs to be remembered. And what was the lesson? It wasn't about charity, though there was charity. It wasn't about money, though money had changed a life. It was about something more fundamental, more important, more human. It was about seeing people, really seeing them. Not as function, not as convenience, not as background to your own life, but as complete human beings with their own pains, hopes, and dignity. Frank Sinatra learned that lesson when he was young and invisible in Hoboken. Tommy McCarthy lived that lesson for 23 years of invisibility at the Sands. And in one night, when their worlds collided, both found something they were looking for. Frank found his purpose again. Tommy found his dignity recognized. And 1,200 people in that room found their conscience. Today, when you hear Fly Me to the Moon, you might not know that the version Frank recorded in 1964, the definitive version that became one of the biggest hits of his career, was recorded less than a year after that night at the Sands. And if you listen carefully, if you really listen, there's something different in it. A depth, an emotion, a meaning that wasn't in earlier versions. Frank once told Quincy Jones, who produced that recording, that he couldn't sing the song the same way after that night. Now means something really said. Now when I sing in other words, hold my hand, I think of Tommy. I think of holding someone's hand who's falling. And that changes everything. The 1964 recording became the version that went to the moon. Literally. When NASA was choosing songs for the Apollo program, Fly Me to the Moon by Sinatra was one of those selected. It was played during the Apollo 10 mission in 1969, and again during Apollo 11, the first manned mission to land on the moon. Buzz Aldrin, years later in an interview, mentioned there was something special about that recording. It had a human quality that other versions didn't have, he said. When you're floating in space, 240,000 miles from home, you need something that reminds you of humanity. That song did that. He didn't know the full story behind the recording. Few did. But somehow, the emotion Frank put into it, the emotion born from seeing Tommy on the floor and choosing humanity over convenience, traveled through the vacuum of space and touched men who looked at Earth from an impossible distance. There are strange connections like that, invisible threads linking seemingly unrelated moments. A waiter stumbles in Las Vegas, and 5 years later, his story is on the moon. How do you explain that? Maybe you don't need to. Maybe it's enough to know that when you choose to see someone, really see them, the waves of that choice travel farther than you could ever imagine. In 1998, 14 years after Tommy McCarthy's death, something remarkable happened. Frank Sinatra was in his final months of life. He was 82 years old, and his body was finally giving out, just as Tommy's had given out that fateful day in 1963. He was at his home in Beverly Hills, surrounded by family, when he asked to see Nancy, his oldest daughter. "I need you to do something for me," he said, his voice weak but clear. "I need you to find Tommy McCarthy's grandchildren, all of them." Nancy was confused at first. It had been so long. But Frank was insistent. "Promise you'll do this. After I'm gone." Nancy promised. And she kept her promise. 6 months after Frank Sinatra's death in May 1998, Nancy Sinatra organized a meeting in Las Vegas. She managed to locate all 5 of Tommy McCarthy's grandchildren, now adults with their own families. They met in a private room on what used to be the grounds of the Sands. Nancy brought a box, an old shoebox, surprisingly modest for someone like Frank Sinatra. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all written by Frank to Tommy over the years, none of them sent. My father wrote them, but never mailed them, Nancy explained, tears in her eyes. He said they were too personal. But he wanted you to know. He wanted you to understand what your grandfather meant to him. The letters were extraordinary. In one, dated December 1963, Frank wrote, "Dear Tommy, today I sang for 50,000 people at Madison Square Garden. Got a standing ovation. But all I could think about was that night at the Sands when I saw you on the floor. That's the performance that matters. That's the moment that defines me." In another, from July 1967, "Tommy, I saw a man being mistreated today at a restaurant. A young waiter dropped something, and the manager humiliated him in front of everyone. I couldn't let it pass. I thought of you. I always think of you in those moments. You're my moral compass, old friend." And in one from 1975, right after Tommy retired, "To my friend on your last day of work, you served with dignity for 37 years. I've sung for almost the same time. But in the end, what we do doesn't matter as much as how we treat people while we do it. You taught me that. I'll never forget." There was one last letter, dated March 1998, just 2 months before Frank's death. His handwriting was shaky, the words difficult to read, but the sentiment was clear. "Tommy, wherever you are, I hope you know that that night changed my life more than any award or gold record. You showed me that fame without humanity is empty. Success without compassion is false. I'll see you soon, old friend. Save a place for me wherever you are. We'll sing together again." Tommy's grandchildren cried reading those letters. They had grown up hearing stories about that magical night in 1963, but never knew how deeply it had affected Frank Sinatra. Never knew that the biggest star of the 20th century had carried their grandfather in his heart for 35 years. "There's more," Nancy said softly. She took out 5 envelopes, one for each grandchild. Inside each was a check and a letter from Frank, written before his death, establishing trust funds for each of them. They weren't obscene amounts, but they were substantial, enough to ensure none of them would ever face the kind of desperation Tommy had faced that night at the hospital. "My father didn't want you to be rich," Nancy explained. "He wanted you to be safe. There's a difference. He wanted you to have the freedom to choose your lives without the terror of poverty your grandfather knew." One of the grandchildren, Thomas McCarthy III, named after his grandfather, spoke through tears. "Why did he do all this? We didn't even know him." Nancy smiled, a mixture of sadness and pride. "Because he knew your grandfather, and your grandfather knew him in a way few could. My father always said there were 2 versions of him. The public version, the one the world saw, and the real version, the one he protected. Your grandfather saw the real version, and my father never forgot." The story could end there. It would be a beautiful ending. But there's an epilogue few people know. In 2003, 5 years after Frank Sinatra's death, the Smithsonian Institution was putting together an exhibition about the golden age of Las Vegas. They wanted to include something about Frank and the Rat Pack, but didn't want just the obvious items, the glamorous clothes and show posters. One of the curators, a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Chun, was researching in the archives when she found something intriguing, a reference in an old newspaper article about an incident at the Sands Hotel in 1963. Most of the details were lost, but there was mention of Frank Sinatra and a waiter. She followed the trail, found Tommy McCarthy Jr., Tommy's oldest son, now 70 years old and living in Henderson, Nevada. When she asked about that night, Tommy Jr. was quiet for a long moment. "My family kept it kind of private," he finally said. "Dad didn't want it to become about him. He always said it was about something bigger." But then he brought out something that made Dr. Chen's heart stop. It was the uniform. The uniform Tommy McCarthy had worn that night, stained old, with a gin stain still visible after 40 years. "Mom wanted to throw it away," Tommy Jr. said, but Dad wouldn't let her. He kept it in a plastic bag in the closet, said it was a reminder. Reminder of what? That the worst moment of your life can become the best. That shame can transform into grace. That there are angels disguised as singers in tuxedos. Dr. Chen asked if they would consider lending the uniform to the exhibition. Tommy Jr. spoke with his siblings, with his own children, with the extended family. The decision was unanimous. Yes, but only if the complete story was told. The exhibition opened in 2004. It was called Vegas Nights, the Golden Age. There was Elvis's iconic white jumpsuit, the sequin dress Liza Minnelli wore, old craps dice and signed playing cards. But the centerpiece, the one that always had a crowd around it, was different. It was a simple mannequin wearing Tommy McCarthy's stained uniform. Next to it, hanging as if being offered, was one of Frank Sinatra's actual tuxedos from 1963. And between the two, on a simple plaque, was the complete story of that night. The exhibition traveled. New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, London. In each city, people crowded around those two uniforms, one from an invisible waiter and one from one of the biggest stars the world has ever known, and read about the night those two worlds collided. But the most remarkable thing was what began to happen afterward. People started leaving notes, small pieces of folded paper, left near the exhibit. The museum staff tried to remove them at first, but there were so many they finally created an official space for them. The notes were extraordinary. I was an Uber driver, and a passenger treated me like Tommy was treated. This story gave me hope, Marcus, Detroit. I'm a restaurant manager. After reading this, I changed how I treat my staff. Thank you, Tommy. Thank you, Frank, Sarah, Boston. My father was a janitor. He died thinking he was invisible. I wish someone had seen him like Frank saw Tommy, anonymous. I was that person who laughed when someone stumbled. I won't be anymore, Jennifer, 16 years old, Chicago. By 2008, when the exhibition closed, more than 10,000 notes had been left. The Smithsonian archived them all, creating an unintentional record of how a story from 1963 was still changing lives decades later. Thomas McCarthy III, the grandson named after his grandfather, was inspired by the exhibition. He had become a lawyer, but after seeing those thousands of notes, after understanding the full impact of his grandfather's story, he changed direction. In 2010, he founded the See Me Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving conditions for hospitality workers. The name came directly from that night at the Sands. What my grandfather wanted most, he explained at the launch, was to be seen, not famous, just seen, recognized as human. The foundation grew. It started in Las Vegas, but spread. Today it operates in 15 states, offering legal assistance, crisis counseling, and financial support for restaurant, hotel, and hospitality workers. It has helped over 50,000 people. And in every See Me Foundation office, there are two photos on the wall. One of Tommy McCarthy in his waiter uniform, smiling shyly at the camera, and one of Frank Sinatra on stage, microphone in hand, eyes closed while he sings. Between the photos, a plaque with a quote from Frank, from one of the unsent letters. True success is not measured by how much you achieve, but by how many you lift up when they fall. There's one final detail, one that closes the circle in an almost mystical way. In 2015, during a renovation at what is now the Venetian Resort, built on the site of the old Sands, construction workers found something buried in the foundation. It was a time capsule, placed there when the Sands was built in 1952. Inside were typical items, newspapers from the time, some coins, photos of the construction. But there was also something unexpected. A small notebook, stained and old, with the name Thomas McCarthy written on the cover. It was Tommy's diary. Not a complete diary. Just a few entries here and there over the years. But there was one entry dated March 24th, 1963, the day after that fateful night. In shaky handwriting, Tommy had written, "Last night, something impossible happened. I fell and the world saw. But it didn't see with judgment. It saw with love. Frank Sinatra, a man I admired only from afar, saw me. Really saw me. And in that moment I understood something. We're not measured by how many times we fall. We're measured by who we choose to help when they fall. Margaret is better today. The doctors are optimistic. But even if she weren't, even if the worst happened, I would die knowing I was seen. That I mattered. That for a moment, my life touched greatness, not because I became great, but because greatness bent down to lift me up. If my children or grandchildren ever read this, I want them to know. Be like Frank. Not the famous Frank Sinatra. The Frank who stopped everything to help an old man who fell. That Frank. Be him. The entry ends there. There's nothing more in the notebook after that date. As if Tommy had written that and decided he didn't need to write anything else. That moment had captured everything that mattered. The notebook is now on permanent display at the Las Vegas Mob Museum in a section about the cultural history of the city. It's not there because of crime or glamour. It's there as a reminder of what Las Vegas could be at its best. A place where dreams come true, but not just dreams of wealth or fame. Dreams of dignity, of being seen. Every year, on March 23rd, the See Me Foundation organizes an event in Las Vegas called Tommy's Night. It's not glamorous. There are no celebrities or red carpet. It's just a simple dinner where hospitality workers are served by hotel managers and owners. For one night, the roles are reversed. Those who normally serve are served. And at the end of the meal, there's always a toast. Someone, usually Thomas McCarthy III, stands up and says the same words every year. To Tommy, who fell but got up. To Frank, who stopped singing to help a friend. And to all of us who have the choice every day to see or ignore, to lift up or let fall, to be the greatness we want to see in the world. And then, through speakers, Frank Sinatra's voice fills the room. Fly Me to the Moon, the 1964 version, the one recorded with the weight of Tommy in his heart. And for 3 minutes and 30 seconds, a room full of people who work hard, who are often invisible, who serve and clean and carry, close their eyes and are seen. They matter. They are remembered. Because in the end, that's what it's all about. Not the lights of Vegas, not the millions of dollars, not the fame that lasts centuries. It's about one man who fell and another who chose to see him. It's about $3,000 that were worth more than all the gold records. It's about a moment where humanity won over convenience. And it's about the simple and devastating truth that Frank Sinatra and Tommy McCarthy taught us that March night in 1963. We all fall eventually. The only question is, when we fall, will there be someone willing to stop everything, to lose convenience, to sacrifice the moment, just to help us get up? And more importantly, when we see someone fall, will we be that person? That's the question that night left us. And it's the question that still resonates, more than 60 years later. Every time someone hears Fly Me to the Moon and remembers that sometimes flying to the moon simply means holding the hand of someone who's falling here on Earth. The legacy of that night continues in ways both big and small. In 2019, a viral video showed a restaurant manager in Seattle stopping service in the middle of dinner rush to help a busboy who had dropped a tray. When asked why he did it, the manager said, "I heard the story about Frank Sinatra and the waiter. I thought, if Frank could stop his show, I can stop mine." The video was viewed 40 million times. Comments flooded in from people sharing their own stories of being seen, of being helped, of choosing to see others. In corporate training programs across America, the story of Frank and Tommy is used as a case study in leadership and human dignity. Business schools at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale included in their ethics curricula. It's become shorthand for a particular kind of leadership, the kind that recognizes humanity before productivity, dignity before efficiency. There's even a term for it now in management literature, the Sinatra principle, which states that true leadership is measured not by how you treat those who can help you, but by how you treat those who can't. But perhaps the most profound impact is in the small moments that never make headlines. The manager who gives a struggling employee an advance without being asked. The customer who leaves an extra large tip when they notice their server looks exhausted. The coworker who stays late to help someone who's falling behind. These moments happen every day, thousands of them. Ripples from a stone thrown into water 60 years ago. Most people doing these things don't even know the original story, but the spirit of it has seeped into culture, become part of the collective understanding of how we should treat each other. In Las Vegas today, there's a tradition among old-time hospitality workers. When they train someone new, when they pass on their knowledge to the next generation, they end their training the same way, They take the new employee aside and tell them the story of Tommy McCarthy and Frank Sinatra, not from a book or a video, but person to person, the way stories used to be told, the way important things used to be remembered. And they always end with the same words. You matter. You're not invisible. And if you ever fall, someone will help you up. And when you see someone else fall, you help them. That's the rule here. That's the Vegas way. Or at least, that's what it should be. Frank Sinatra recorded hundreds of songs in his lifetime. He won Grammys, Oscars, sold millions of records. He performed for presidents and kings. But if you ask people who study his life, who really understand his legacy, many will tell you that the most important performance of his career wasn't recorded. It wasn't filmed. It exists only in memory and in the lives it changed. It was 3 minutes on a stage in Las Vegas when he chose to see a man that everyone else had chosen to ignore. There's a quote, often misattributed to various famous people, that actually comes from one of Frank's unsent letters to Tommy. It reads, "In the end, we will not be judged by the stages we stood on, but by the people we lifted up, not by the applause we received, but by the tears we dried, not by the fame we achieved, but by the dignity we restored." Frank Sinatra understood something that night that many never learn, that greatness isn't about being seen. It's about seeing. It's not about being lifted up. It's about lifting others. And it's not about the spotlight finding you. It's about using whatever light you have to illuminate someone else's darkness. Tommy McCarthy never wanted to be famous. He just wanted to be seen. Frank Sinatra was already famous beyond measure, but he wanted to matter. And in that collision of needs, in that perfect moment when a stumbling waiter and a singing legend looked at each other and saw not status or class or wealth or poverty, but simply two human beings, something magical happened. Something that transcended entertainment or charity or even kindness. Something that touched the divine spark that exists in all of us. The part that recognizes we are all connected, all vulnerable, all deserving of dignity. The Copa room where it all happened is gone now. The Sands Hotel is dust and memory. Frank Sinatra and Tommy McCarthy are both at rest. But the story lives. It lives in the See Me Foundation that helps thousands. It lives in the notes left at museum exhibits. It lives in the business school case studies and the viral videos. It lives in every moment when someone chooses compassion over convenience, humanity over efficiency, seeing over ignoring. And maybe that's the real miracle of that night. Not that Frank gave Tommy $3,000, though that changed a life. Not that he created a fund that helped thousands, though that mattered deeply. The real miracle is that he gave us all a story that reminds us who we can be at our best. A story that says you don't have to be Frank Sinatra to make a difference. You just have to be willing to see, to stop, to care, to choose the person over the performance, the human over the inconvenience, the heart over the schedule. In a world that often feels cold and disconnected, where people are reduced to functions and services, where we're all taught to look past each other rather than at each other, the story of Frank and Tommy stands as a monument to a different way, a better way, the human way. So the next time you hear "Fly Me to the Moon," remember that somewhere in that recording is the echo of a man falling and another man stopping to help. Remember that the voice singing about flying to the moon belonged to someone who understood that the greatest heights aren't measured in altitude, but in how far you're willing to reach down to lift someone up. And remember that you have that power too. Every day, every moment, with every person you encounter who's invisible, struggling, falling, you have the power to see them, to stop, to help, to be someone's Frank Sinatra. And maybe if we all do that, if we all remember the lesson of that March night in 1963, the world becomes a little less cold, a little more kind, a little more human. That would be the ultimate tribute to Tommy McCarthy, who fell and was lifted up, and to Frank Sinatra, who stopped singing to remind us all what really matters. Not the songs, not the fame, not the money or the lights or the applause. Just this, one human being seeing another, one hand reaching down to another, one heart recognizing another. That's the real story. That's the real legacy. That's what lives forever.